These slides will go in depth regarding the 7 features of the system of higher order cognition. And these slides are also intended to accompany an assignment for this week that you'll find on the Moodle page called 7 Features of the System. So I'll go through each of these slides and talk about the features shown, and then after you've listened to this mini lecture, if you go back, you can then use each of these slides as the basis for completing one of the components of the 7 features of the system activity on the Moodle page. So we'll start with concept formation. Now, concept formation is defined as integrating a series of features that often go together to form a class of ideas or objects. And concept formation can look a few different ways. It can be verbally conceptualized, so concepts that are thought about and discussed and communicated through language. Emotions are often conceived of through language. Symbolism is often discussed through language and writing. Students that have an affinity or strength in verbal conceptualization will often want to describe their thinking using words. Students who have a weakness in verbal conceptualization might have difficulty understanding abstract concepts in content areas such as social studies. Something like liberalism, democracy would be a challenging concept for a student who has difficulty expressing themselves and understanding the world in a language-based manner. Concept formation also has nonverbal conceptualization as a component, and that has more to do with forming concepts without language. So students who have strength in nonverbal conceptualization might show an understanding of geometric shapes, of the solar system and planetary movements, of place value and equations. They might use visual imagery to understand concepts, and they easily and maybe take to and enjoy interpreting maps, graphs, and charts. Process conceptualization is about forming concepts that explain a mechanism or how something works. So students with a strong process conceptualization will show an understanding of processes, metamorphosis, daily temperature fluctuation, nuclear energy are examples of things that students with a strong process conceptualization might think about well and might take to. Students with weak process conceptualization will probably have trouble explaining how things work. For example, steps in the scientific process, steps of photosynthesis, or steps of metamorphosis as well. These 3 forms of concept formation are really crucial for learning in the classroom. And students that have strength in them are really supported by the way concept formation facilitates learning and supporting in-depth understanding. It allows students to compare and contrast ideas, to classify knowledge, to draw inferences, combine ideas, and communicate. For example, students who know the concept of Impressionism are better able to classify paintings and artists and contrast this style with other styles. Students who have weaknesses in concepts are often challenged by trying to learn each of the critical features that define a particular concept over and over again without the benefit of that categorization to rely upon in their thinking. When you're ready, you can either pause this mini lecture and go to the 7 features of the system activity on the Moodle page, or go back after you've listened to all the slides. And then please think about an example of a classroom task or learning activity that involves at least one of the components listed above. So either verbal conceptualization, nonverbal conceptualization, or process conceptualization. And then include that in our database chart that we'll be creating based on these activities for this week. The next feature of higher order cognition we'll be talking about is critical thinking. Critical thinking is defined as being able to evaluate products, ideas, or opinions. Critical thinking is also really crucial in the classroom for learning, and is something that students are called upon to do throughout the day and across content areas. One example might be, imagine reading a story aloud to your class that has a very clear moral. Then you ask the students to identify the moral. If one of the students seems to struggle with understanding that there is a moral or what that moral is and chooses to retell the story instead, that might be a clue that student is struggling with critical thinking. They may or may not be able to pick up on the underlying message of the story and instead relate to the more concrete or obvious features of the story. Many of the Common Core state standards that are recently being introduced into the classroom really feature and emphasize students' ability to engage in critical thinking. Comparing and contrasting ideas, looking at the benefits and drawbacks of particular ways of being or particular mathematical strategies are examples of when students in the classroom are called upon to use critical thinking. Engaging in debate, and synthesizing or looking across primary sources of texts to think about the messages that they put across and the knowledge that they impart. Again, after listening to this, please, when you're ready, go to the Wiki activity on the Moodle page and include an example of a classroom task that you think involves critical thinking in your work. The next feature is creativity and brainstorming. And this is defined as thinking independently and producing self-generated thoughts or other products. Students who have a strength in creativity and brainstorming, they often really seek opportunities to come up with independent ideas and unique thoughts in the classroom. And students like this may be eager to come up with ideas for writing, come up with ideas for drawing, unique ways of representing knowledge and engaging in discussion. Students who struggle with creativity or brainstorming may seek more direction from teachers regarding specifically what they're being asked to do. In fact, it may cause stress for students who struggle with creativity and brainstorming not to be able to rely upon a set of fixed directions. Something to think about in the classroom is where we might be offering students the opportunity for creativity and in what ways some students might benefit from scaffolding or assistance with coming up with creative and unique ideas. Problem solving. And that's defined as applying a systematic, stepwise approach to complex questions or challenges. With the transition towards Common Core approaches to teaching, problem solving is something that students are being asked to do in the classroom with more and more independence. And in addition to that, they're being asked to be able to describe their approaches to problem solving and compare different problem solving solutions. Now, this can strengthen students' abilities and skills in the area of problem solving, especially for students who come in with an existing strength in that component feature. For students who struggle with problem solving, this may present new challenges for them and also may be a source of stress if they're used to being able to rely upon a fixed set of procedures that are no longer available to them with new approaches to teaching. So something to think about is for students who may have a struggle in problem solving, what are some of the ways that we might introduce scaffolds for them or supports for them to understand the underlying structure of how they're approaching problems and how they might learn from and build upon past experiences with problem solving. When you're ready, take your time, think about an example of a classroom task or learning activity in your work that involves problem solving, and please add that to the page on the Moodle site. Another feature of the system of higher order cognition is rule use, and that's learning and developing and applying rules and principles. So now these rules and principles for students to know are sometimes really explicit in the classroom, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But some are more implicit and less easily identified. Rule use is something that has also been undergoing a shift since the introduction of the Common Core. As rather than presenting in a very explicit fashion the rules students are to use to solve problems and to engage in particular content in the classroom, students are now asked to construct their own rules quite often, describe those rules, and apply them on their own. For students who struggle with rule use, Again, they may really need to rely upon some supports and scaffolds for understanding the development of rules, the purpose of rules, and the application of rules in the classroom. The next feature we're going to be thinking about is reasoning and logical thinking. And this is defined as coming up with sensible, thoughtful answers to complex issues. Now, while reasoning and logical thinking can be conducted outside the verbal realm, most often in the classroom, it is done using a language-based approach. Students are asked to develop arguments through language, express those to either through a written format or through verbal discussion, and then compare and contrast answers to each other to see what makes the most sense. For students who struggle with higher order cognition or with language, reasoning and logical thinking can be a particularly taxing activity to engage in. It also places demands on active working memory, as students need to do a lot of that checking back and forth and sense making. It's also involving attention, because in order to sustain attention to the concepts that are being manipulated and considered in the head, students really need to be able to focus on these ideas for a sustained amount of time. Now, of course, there are approaches to using reasoning and logical thinking that are non-verbally based, that are more perhaps spatial, puzzles, visually based problem-solving activities, mapping. These are all kinds of activities that could reduce the language-based demands on reasoning and logical thinking, but are often less commonly used and utilized by teachers in the classroom to support students who are struggling. That said, perhaps you'll come up with an example of a classroom task or learning activity that you engage in with students that involves reasoning and logical thinking in a nonverbal format. You may also include ideas on the 7 features of the system activity on the Moodle page that are verbally based. It's an option for you. But please think about something from your classroom or your work that involves reasoning and logical thinking and add it when you're ready. The final feature of the system we'll be describing in terms of higher order cognition is mental representation. Now, this is defined as portraying new ideas in one's mind so that they are meaningful and lasting. Being able to, for students that struggle with language, mental representation is a quite common and key approach to supporting their language recall, development, and improvement of skills. Mental representations can be used across content areas in the curriculum and are a very key tool that's used to support students in being able to grasp the key concepts of a topic and recall information that accompanies it. Take a moment, think about an example of a classroom task or learning activity in your work that involves mental representation, or that might benefit from the incorporation of mental representation for students. I hope everyone enjoys and has fun with this task. It's intended to allow us to learn from each other as we're thinking about higher order cognition and the ways it operates in the classroom. And I'll see you soon.